In this tutorial, I'm going to review some of the data relationships that exist among the key tables in tracer-related exports. The topics in this video will relate both to Tracer for Revit and Tracer IFC exports because they use a very similar set of data tables and relationships when you produce a relational database export from either Revit or IFC. So the topics here should translate pretty cleanly between either of those product exports. But one of the things that we often come across and some of the questions that we encounter involve understanding the relationships between the different key tables and how you can leverage that relationship structure to build reports. And one of the really powerful things about Power BI is this ability to manage relationships between data sources, as well as then perform data transformations to get the data into a format that you may want or need for your report scenario. So what I have here is a blank Power BI report, and what I've done is also made reference to a database export, and I've brought in the key tables that are central to the relational graph that exists within the database. So we have a document table, we have an element table, so a document will contain elements, and then elements contain parameters. So we then have a set of parameter tables, and here you can see I'm referencing an integer table, a number table, and a text table. These are referring to the types of parameters that may be on top of any given element in a document, right? So, there are relationships that exist between these tables, and one of the ways that you can manage those relationships is by going to the relationship manager in Power BI. You can see that we've got, by default, when you open up Power BI, you're in the report environment. You can also go to the data environment, which will show you table representations of each of the data sources that you've connected to. And then we also have the model. And this refers to the data model in the various sources that you've brought in. And a data model is going to refer to not only the sources of data, but the relationships that might exist between these data sources. And so what you can do within this interface is start to draw relationships that will tell Power BI how to relate certain information. Now, by default, when you bring these tables in, Power BI may very well generate these relationships for you. It will find identifiers in each of these tables and draw a relationship graph. What I've done for this tutorial is I've deleted a lot of those because I wanted to step through the different relationships and how you might set one up from scratch to start things off. So I'm going to start and move left to right. I'm going to look at this document table here, and I can see that my document table has what's called a document ID. And what I want to do is use this document ID and join it in with all of my element records. And so my element records also have a document ID established. So I'm going to click on document ID in document, and I'm going to drag it over and connect it to document ID in element. And what that's going to do is it's going to establish a one-directional relationship between these two tables. So I have my document data now, and it's established this kind of one-to-many. So there's a document ID, and then there's a bunch of elements associated with that document ID. There's a one-to-many relationship. And what you'll also notice is that this arrow indicator is indicating that this is a one-directional relationship. So I can kind of filter and highlight data from document, and it'll impact elements. But if I click and highlight on an element, it won't necessarily cross-filter back to document. And one of the things that you can do here with these relationships is right-click and go to Properties. And if you want this to be a two-directional cross-filter direction, you can see that there is a cross-filter direction option here, and I can say I want this to actually apply to both directions instead of just one direction. And you can hit OK, and that will allow you to then see a two-directional relationship between these tables. And depending on your use case, you might want to have one direction, and you might also want to have two directions. I tend to use two-direction relationships a lot just because of the way that, I might want to cross-filter from a parameter back to an element, for example. But then, working again left to right, I can start to work through a couple of these other relationships. So here we have our base element table. This is creating an itemized record of all elements. If I even jump back to the data tab here and click on elements, you can see that we've got a rather lengthy list of element records with, the name and type and geometry and stuff associated with it. But these elements are itemized by an element ID. And what you'll see when you look at the parameter tables is that they also have element IDs for these parameters. And the element ID is what you're going to use to create a one-to-many relationship between these tables. So I'm clicking on element ID and I'm going to drag this over and draw a relationship connection to the element ID in element parameter number. So this is now joining my element records to all of then the associated parameters that are tied to that element with regards to numeric parameters. And I can also go in and say, okay, I'm going to make this a two-directional relationship and have it cross-filter in both directions as well. And I'm going to do the same step for integer. So I'm going to use element ID as my join to the element parameter integer table as well. Drag and drop. And then right click on properties, and I'm going to go ahead and do both directions. And then I'm going to do the same thing for text. So I'm going to take element ID and tie it into element ID for element parameter text. And now I have this relational graph that ties document to element to all of its parameters. I'm going to make sure this is also both directions also. So this graph is very important when it comes to navigating and transversing data at different levels of the information hierarchy that's present in the tracer database. But what this also allows us to do is to do some novel data transformations and queries on the data using Power BI. So Power BI is one of those platforms that is easy to learn initially, and then has all sorts of layers of features and workflows that can take a while to master, but ultimately becomes very powerful as an overall system. And so what I want to do now that I have this data relationship established, is start working through a couple of data transformations that might be helpful to your workflow in terms of accessing parameters and properties. So why don't we first use this graph to set up a couple of visuals in our report. Now that we have the relationships between the tables established, maybe what we can do is create a very lightweight scenario in our report here to express how these relationships work, and then we'll start to do some data transformations to look at different opportunities here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a slicer. The slicer is going to allow us to filter out different categories of elements that might be in our model, and get to maybe just a select number of elements that might be in a given export. So with the slicer selected, I'm going to expand element, and I'm going to select my category field, which is going to list the IFC categories present in the model. And here you can see that we have a variety of IFC categories for this particular model. If you're using the Revit export, you can use categories and see Revit element categories. Here I'm using IFC categories. But in this case, I'm going to maybe just isolate spaces, for example, and we won't really see much happening elsewhere, but by clicking on any one of these element categories, it's going to isolate the data to just elements that pertain to that category. And what I'm also going to do is then generate a visual for the three-dimensional representation of the elements that are selected. That'll help us kind of understand what selections we've made in 3 dimensions, and this is where the tracer visual comes in handy. And this visual can render 3-dimensional information in our Power BI browser. So I'm going to take, after activating the tracer visual, I'm going to take the mesh input and drag that into geometry or ID. And then I'm also going to take that mesh input and put it into geometry or ID for highlighting. And so now we have this selection of spaces because I've isolated, in this case, the space category. And if I go to IFC stair, for example, or let's see, stair flight might be one. There's some stair objects here. So yeah, this just allows us to quickly iterate through and understand the different objects in the element tab here. But I'm going to focus mostly on spaces here, so I'm just going to go back to those IFC spaces. So now that I have those objects selected, I'm going to go ahead and maybe pull out a table here that will let me look at a couple of the parameters associated with these objects. So I'm going to go ahead and create a table here. And this table is going to be reflective of some text parameters that are assigned to these objects here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my element parameter text, and I'm going to get the name of the parameter, which is going to list all available parameters for these objects, and also I'm going to get the value here. And so you can see that there's a category code, there's various bits of text information. But because we have this relational graph, if I were to click in on one of these spaces, let's say it's this corner space right here, this is going to filter out only the parameters, those text parameters that pertain to that object, because we have a one-to-many relationship between the element table and this text table. And the same can be done for numeric parameters as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out a new table here, and we're going to look at the numeric parameters, and we're going to look at the name and the value fields as well. So now we have numeric parameters that are listing things like the area, and the volume, unbounded height, perimeter, those types of properties for that object. And as I click through these different objects, you'll see that these tables are updating with that new selection. So it becomes a really powerful mechanism for, using that relational graph to, generate this type of reporting, right? But there are a couple of opportunities now that we can use these relationships to create data transformations within Power BI that may be very helpful and powerful for you to use. Like, let's say I wanted a table that summarized a couple of key parameters across these different objects. Or maybe I want to merge all of my parameters together into one single table. That's where data transformations come in really handy. So inside of Power BI, you can see that we have a Transform Data tab and a button in the ribbon, I should say. And what this environment allows us to do is interrogate the data sources that we've brought in, and also perform a couple of stepped transformations to those data sources. So it kind of opens up this separate window, and here you can see that we have our data sources. So here we have our document and element, element parameters, and so on. This is actually derived from a template, so there are a few parameters. We won't really touch on those in this tutorial, but the key thing to note is that you're able to reference these tables, and then when you go into any particular table, you'll see that there are what are called applied steps to them. So when you make a connection to any data source, here you can see it's made a connection to a database. It's gotten the source data, and it is doing a couple of transformations for splitting columns, changing types, things like that. Some of these transformations might be auto-generated just by Power BI, but what you can do now is use the transformation steps to do some pretty novel things. So let's say, for example, I wanted to take each of these parameter tables and produce one single table that lists all parameters for objects. Maybe I don't want them parsed out based on their type of data here. Well, one thing that we can do here is use an append query. Append queries are extremely powerful if you have tables that are of the same shape to kind of combine them together into a single table listing. And because these parameter tables all have the same column fields, it makes it very natural for us to create an append query here that might combine them together. So I'm going to go to the drop down of append query at the top, and I'm going to choose append queries as new. And here what I can do is I can say, well, maybe I want to append 3 or more tables together, because I do have 3 tables: element, parameter, text, number, and integer. So we have text already. I'm going to append the number parameter, and I'm going to append the integer parameter. And I'm going to hit OK. And this is going to create a new append query as a data source. And what this appended query is going to result in is a combination of all available parameters across those 3 tables. So we'll give it here a second to load, and there it is. And you can kind of see here that it's it's the same table structure as before, and yeah, we now have this kind of appended set of data here. So what I can do here is I can go ahead and rename this field to be all, let's call it element parameters all as such. And I'm going to go ahead and close and apply these into the model. And we can kind of see what we've got here. So it's going to go through the process of loading, making sure everything's loading in, element parameters all, got all our records. And what I'm going to do here is delete these tables that I had established before. And instead now I'm going to create a new table off to the side, and we're going to use element parameters all as our field source here. So I'm going to use the name and the value for all of these pieces. And if I click on an object, what we should see then is a listing of the available parameters for all of those objects. And what's kind of nice here is that you can see, like, we have our areas combined in with our text parameters and our offsets, all that stuff, all the things that existed across these 3, or the text, the number, and integer table, all represented as a single list. So pretty powerful when it comes to just combining data together in this manner. There are other transformations that we can sort of enact that might become helpful if you're trying to wrangle your data and represent it in some way. So in this case, it's the intent is to append your data together so it doesn't exist in one multiple tables, but exists in one single table, which can be really helpful. But there's another type of transformation that I often find myself using, and that involves merging queries together. And a merge query can be quite useful if, for example, you wanted to do like if you wanted to sort of pivot the table of information in some way, or create a way to sort of isolate select parameters and bring them out as a single table. So that's kind of what I'm going to do here. I'm going to create a new table that identifies a couple of parameters, and I'm going to use a set of transformation steps to get to it. So one of the things I can do here is I can first go to element parameter text, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to duplicate this table. And so now I have a duplicate of element parameter text. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this element parameter text, and I'm just going to kind of extend it with just name. And because what I want to do with this table is I'm going to filter just for name parameter values on the table itself. So I've got it listed now as name, and what I can do here in these columns is go to the name tab, the name field, for the various properties. And I'm going to unselect all of them, and I'm going to search for name. And you can see that it's searching all selected. I might need to load more. Sometimes if you search for a parameter that is there but isn't immediately appearing, you have to actually load more properties. And that's what I'm going to do there. And then I'm going to type in name. And then you can see that we have a field here for object name. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that. That's a property on my object. Hit OK. And so now what it's done is it has isolated all parameters that just have names. So it's kind of excluded everything else, and I've filtered all of my rows to just those properties. And what I might do then is do a little bit of additional formatting here to my table. So I've applied the filtered rows step. I'm going to actually go ahead and remove the name field as such, and then I'm going to right click on the value of the name field. I'm going to rename this name, because all the properties that are listed here refer to the name field that I've identified. So that in some ways that column that listed the name was superfluous now at this point, because I've now reformatted my table. I now have a name field. But what I want to do is also have a column here that lists the area. So for every name that's listed here, I want the area of that object. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to my element parameter number, and I'm going to right click and duplicate that table as well. And I'm going to right click on element parameter number and rename it. I'm going to rename it area, because I want to get the area of my objects and isolate those properties out. And I'm going to go through a very similar set of steps as before. I'm going to expand the column that's listed as name, and I'm going to search for only my area parameter here. So I'm going to deselect everything, and I'm going to select on my area property, and I'm going to hit OK. That's going to isolate now the area property for all the objects in the model. And I can go ahead and remove this column, and then I'm going to go ahead and rename the value field to be area. So now we have a table that's isolated the name property, and a table that's isolated the area property. And we can see that those are applied transformational steps to the data. So if we ever wanted to go back in time or edit anything, we can do that with the query settings here, which makes data transformations very, very powerful and kind of parametric in many ways. What I want to do now is take the values for name and area and combine them into a single table that I might be able to then use to create a table in my report that lists name and an area next to each other. So what I can do here is, instead of using the append query, I'm going to use the merge query. And what I want to do is merge queries as new. And that's going to create another table here that will show us how things have been merged together. And so here it says select tables and matching columns to create a merge table. So I have my element parameter text name, and I want to merge it with my element parameter number area. And I'm going to merge it on my element ID, because the element ID is going to be the type of object that's going to, the identifier that's going to allow us to relate an element's name to an element's area and have them combined into a single table. And you can see that there is a selection that matches across here. So there's 269 elements matching up with the across these tables, and I can hit OK. And that's going to generate a new merge query, and I'm going to go ahead and rename this query name area. And so that's going to be now represented as a new table. And what I can also then do here is do a little bit of formatting and expansion to the table. So you can see that I have my table with the name field, and then you can see that it's being joined in with element parameter number area. I'm going to go ahead and expand this. And what I want to do is just expand my area value. And I can even say use original column name as a prefix. I don't want that. I just want the field named area. So I don't need it to say element parameter number dot area, for example. I just want to hit, just want that area column. And when this expands, you're going to see now that we have a new table that lists the element ID for an object, the name of the object, and its area. So as a formatted table here, which is something made possible by the relationship queries that we've so far established. So what I can do here is then close and apply. And it's going to load that new table in. And once we have that new table in, we'll see that we have the name and area field, and what I can do here is create another table here just to check it out. And you can see that, okay, maybe I want a table now that just lists name and area together. And now we're getting an itemized record. In this case, because we filtered to spaces, we're getting a three-dimensional view of those elements, and then we're also getting an itemized record of each of the space names and each of their areas as a table. So again, it's pivoted, these data transformations have allowed me to pivot the relational model into a table that allows me to summarize that information in a way that makes, might make sense to the report. And if I start to interrogate this information here, it's allowed me to drill down into each of the spaces that I have selected, and have it report both the name and the area for that space. So this can become a really powerful way. Data transformations are extremely powerful for you to be able to wrangle your information, connect data sources together, merge queries, append queries, and so on to make a coherent dashboard. And what I like about this is that you're able to use those sort of core sources of information coming out of Tracer to then compose data in such a way that tells your story. I can even, for example, take this area table now and say, okay, well, I want to, generate a bar chart that takes the name and area as inputs, and now gives me a record or a visual that shows the kind of available area per space name. So I hope this was helpful. This is a lengthier tutorial than what I normally do, but there's a lot here to unpack, right? Because what we wanted to do was understand both the tables that are available in the Tracer exports for Revit and IFC at a high level. We wanted to understand then the relational graphs that exist within among the tables, and then we're using the data transformation tools to manipulate this data and get it into formats that are going to be useful for our reporting scenarios. So enjoy these techniques, and continue to dive in and see what's there for data transformations.